The girl woke up from her coma and screamed, but her words made her father go cold. She remembered things she wasn't supposed to know. What was the doctor hiding, and why didn't he want her to wake up? Sign and write where you're watching us from. A faint beeping sound echoed through the silent room, slow and methodical. The steady rhythm of a heart monitor accompanied the sterile hum of fluorescent lights overhead, casting a pale glow on the unconscious girl lying in the hospital bed. The air smelled of antiseptic and something stale, like a place where time had long since stopped. Layla's eyelids fluttered slightly, her breath shallow, her small chest rising and falling in a delicate rhythm. Inside the depths of her mind, there was only darkness, a heavy, suffocating blackness that clung to her like a weighted blanket, pulling her down, holding her still. She felt trapped, locked away in a place where no one could reach her. For a long time, she had existed in that void, neither awake nor asleep, drifting between whispers and silence. Then something changed, a flicker of awareness. At first, it was distant, like a ripple in an endless sea, a vague sensation of presence, of something waiting. Layla's body felt heavy, unmovable, but deep within her mind, a pulse of recognition stirred. A sound reached her ears, soft, muffled, but real. Beeping. A machine. The awareness grew sharper, pushing against the thick fog that held her captive. Her fingers twitched. The sensation startled her. It was the first real movement she had felt in how long? She didn't know. She didn't even remember falling asleep. The fog in her mind thickened as confusion set in. Something wasn't right. A strange tightness coiled around her chest, making it difficult to breathe. She felt pressure, as if invisible hands were pressing down on her ribs. Her throat burned. Her skin tingled, cold and clammy. Then, voices, distant murmurs, a soft shuffling of feet, a whisper too faint to understand. Her mind grasped at the sounds, but they slipped away before she could catch them. Panic flickered beneath the surface, a sharp, unfamiliar terror that clenched her small hands into fists beneath the hospital blanket. Who was speaking? Where was she? Why couldn't she remember? Layla's breathing hitched. The fog clouding her mind thickened, but beneath it, something else stirred. A memory, faint and broken, a flash of light, a sound, metal crushing against metal, screaming. Then, darkness. Something had happened. Something terrible. Her heartbeat accelerated, the steady beeping of the machine becoming erratic as her pulse surged. Her eyelids fluttered more violently now, a desperate attempt to break free from the invisible force keeping her trapped. Her fingers curled tighter, nails digging into her palm. She needed to wake up. Wake up. Wake up. Her eyes flew open, blinding white light. Her breath hitched sharply as the brightness burned into her retinas, her pupils struggling to adjust. Everything around her was stark and colorless, the sterile walls, the bright ceiling, the hospital equipment humming beside her bed. A needle was taped into her arm, an IV connected to a clear bag of liquid hanging on a metal stand. The air was cold, the smell sharp and clinical. She wasn't home. She was somewhere unfamiliar. Fear shot through her, a wild, animalistic fear that tightened her throat. She tried to move, but her limbs felt sluggish, weak, as if she had been buried under a mountain of exhaustion. Then she saw him. A man sitting beside her bed. His face was tired, lined with worry, but his dark eyes shone with something raw. Relief. He had stubble on his jaw, his clothes slightly wrinkled as if he had been sitting there for days without leaving. Her mind struggled to place him, but deep inside, recognition pulsed. Dad. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Her throat felt dry, raw like she hadn't spoken in weeks. Then he reached for her hand, and she recoiled, a sharp, involuntary movement. His face fell, confusion flashing in his eyes. But Layla wasn't looking at him anymore. Something in her brain snapped into place. A voice, a cold, low whisper. She cannot wake up. Her entire body stiffened. The words slithered into her consciousness like a poisonous vine, wrapping around her thoughts, choking out all rationality. The voice wasn't familiar, but it was terrifyingly real. She had heard it. She had heard it while she was asleep. Her breathing quickened, her small chest rising and falling in rapid, uneven gasps. Her heart pounded so loudly that she could hear it in her ears. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. Her father spoke her name, his voice gentle, but she barely heard him. The sound of his voice was distant, drowned out by the deafening rush of her own fear. Then it hit her. The memories she couldn't grasp before came crashing back all at once. She remembered the accident, the blinding headlights, the screech of tires, the impact, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what came after. Layla's lips trembled as fragmented images pieced themselves together in her mind. She remembered being trapped in the darkness. And in that darkness, someone had spoken to her. Someone had been there, whispering. Not her father, not a nurse, not anyone she knew. A stranger, a man in white. Her vision blurred, her head spinning as fear surged through her veins like liquid ice. The voice echoed in her skull, whispering the same words over and over. She cannot wake up. She gasped, the air refusing to enter her lungs properly. The terror coiled around her like a suffocating grip, and before she even realized what she was doing, a scream tore from her throat. "Don't let him come near me. He did it. He'll kill me." The room exploded into chaos. The machines around her shrieked with rapid beeping as her vitals spiked. Her father stood abruptly, his face stricken with shock. The door burst open. A doctor rushed in. Layla's body convulsed with sheer panic as her terrified gaze landed on the figure in the doorway. Tall, dressed in white, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. She remembers. And for the first time since she had woken up, Layla wished she had stayed asleep. The room was in chaos. The shrill beeping of the heart monitor echoed in Layla's ears, each rapid pulse signaling the panic consuming her body. Her scream still hung in the air, raw and desperate, and she could feel her father's hands gripping her shoulders, trying to steady her. The hospital bed sheets tangled around her small frame as she struggled, her limbs weak but driven by sheer terror. She barely registered her father's frantic voice, calling her name, trying to calm her down. Her world had shrunk to one single focal point, the tall figure standing in the doorway, framed by the fluorescent lights of the hallway. Dr. Collins' pristine white coat seemed too bright, almost blinding against the sterile hospital room. His face was carefully composed, his expression exuding nothing but calm professionalism. But Layla wasn't fooled. She knew him. She had heard him. Even though his lips weren't moving, his voice was there, whispering in the back of her mind. She cannot wake up. Her stomach twisted violently, a wave of nausea crashing over her. Cold sweat beaded along her forehead, her small hands gripping the sheets as if anchoring herself to reality. The presence of this man, the man in white, was like a dark storm cloud looming over her, suffocating, inescapable. Dr. Collins stepped further into the room, his polished shoes clicking softly against the tiled floor. His expression remained neutral, professional. He addressed Darius first, his voice smooth, even reassuring. "She's having a panic attack. he said. It's not uncommon for coma patients to experience extreme disorientation upon waking. It's likely she's suffering from a combination of nightmares and post-traumatic stress. Layla shook her head furiously. No, 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 no. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't some foggy post-coma hallucination. She remembered. She remembered him, and he was lying. Her breathing came in rapid, shallow gulps. The walls of the hospital room seemed to close in around her. Her father was speaking to the doctor now, asking something, but the words barely reached her. Her mind was screaming, warning her, telling her to run. But she couldn't run. She was trapped. Dr. Collins turned to her now, his gaze steady, unreadable. He took slow, deliberate steps toward the bed. And then he smiled. It was small, barely noticeable, just a slight upward twitch of his lips. But it was wrong. The same way a predator watches its prey from the shadows. The same way someone smiles when they already know the ending of the story. Layla recoiled, pressing herself deeper into the bed, her heart hammering so loudly she could barely think. Her father noticed the way she reacted, how her body stiffened, how her eyes darted wildly. His brows furrowed, concern flickering in his tired eyes. "Layla, sweetheart," he murmured, kneeling beside her bed. "It's okay. You're safe." Safe? No, she wasn't. She tried to speak, to form the words to tell him, to make him understand, but her throat was raw, her voice caught in the panic that gripped her. Dr. Collins' gaze never left her. She felt like an insect pinned under glass. "I'd like to examine her," he said, shifting his attention back to Darius. "The best thing for her right now is rest. If we let the panic continue, it might cause complications with her recovery." Layla shook her head violently. "No, no, no, no! Don't let him touch me!" Her body trembled so fiercely that her father had to steady her. His worry deepened, but he was torn between trusting the doctor and believing the raw fear in his daughter's eyes. I don't know." Darius hesitated, looking back at Layla. "She's obviously terrified of something, which is exactly why I should evaluate her condition," Collins countered smoothly. "Trauma can do strange things to the mind. She's fragile right now. We don't want to exacerbate her distress." "Exacerbate her distress?" Layla wanted to scream at him. "You are my distress." Her pulse pounded so hard it felt like her body was rejecting his presence, like every nerve in her being was screaming for her to run. Then, for just a second, something in Colin's face changed. A flicker, a shift in his expression so quick that only she noticed. His eyes darkened, not with concern, but with something else. Something cold, something knowing. And in that moment, she understood. This wasn't just a doctor. He knew what she'd seen. He knew she remembered, and he was making sure she wouldn't talk. The realization hit her like a punch to the chest, knocking the air from her lungs. Her father, oblivious to the silent battle unfolding between them, rubbed her arm soothingly. "Layla, baby, do you want Dr. Collins to check on you?" She wanted to scream no. She wanted to rip the IV out of her arm and run out the door, but she couldn't. Because if she said no, Collins would know she was fully aware of the truth, and she didn't know what he would do to make sure she never spoke of it again. So instead, she did the only thing she could do. She squeezed her father's hand, knuckles turning white, and whispered, "I'm tired." Collins tilted his head slightly, as if analyzing her choice of words. Darius exhaled, relief evident in his tired posture. "Okay, sweetheart, we'll let you rest." He turned to Collins. "Maybe later." The doctor hesitated, but then he smiled again, that same smile, before giving a slow nod. "Of course," he said, "rest is the best medicine." Layla closed her eyes, but she didn't relax. She couldn't, because she knew the truth now. Collins didn't just want her to sleep. He wanted to make sure she never woke up again. And if she wasn't careful, he would find a way to finish what he started. Layla kept her eyes shut long after Dr. Collins left the room. She lay there, her breath shallow, her fingers curled into the bedsheet beneath her. She wanted to believe that if she stayed still enough, silent enough, she could disappear into the fabric, melt into the sterile world around her, and escape his gaze. But even with her eyelids squeezed shut, she felt the weight of his presence lingering in the room long after he was gone. She wasn't safe. Not here. Not in this place. Not while he was watching. Darius sat beside her, rubbing slow circles on the back of her hand, his presence grounding her, but there was a heaviness in his touch, a weight behind it that told her he was thinking, processing. She couldn't see his face, but she knew he was replaying the moment over and over in his head. The way she had reacted to Dr. Collins, the sheer terror in her eyes, the way she had screamed at the top of her lungs. She could feel his doubt creeping in, and she needed him to listen to it. Layla wished she could tell him everything. She wished she could find the words, but every time she thought about saying them out loud, something inside her stopped her. Fear coiled tight in her stomach, because she knew that if she said it, if she told her father what she remembered, Dr. Collins would know. And if he knew, he would make sure she never spoke again. She needed to be smart. She needed time. So she forced herself to relax, loosening the tight grip on the blankets. She let her breathing slow, her body still, even as her mind spun. Darius exhaled heavily beside her, running a hand over his face. "You rest, sweetheart," he murmured softly. "We'll talk later." Layla barely nodded, but she felt the air shift as he stood. The chair creaked as he pushed it back, his footsteps soft against the floor. He hesitated for a long moment before finally leaving the room. Only when the door clicked shut behind him did she let her body tremble again. Darius stepped into the dimly lit hospital hallway, rubbing a tired hand over his face. The tension that had built in his chest since Layla's awakening wasn't fading. It was growing. Something wasn't right. He had waited for this moment for so long, had dreamed of seeing his daughter's eyes open again. He had thought relief would be the only thing he felt when that day finally came. But instead, it was fear. That look in her eyes, she had been terrified. Not confused, not groggy, not lost in some post-coma haze. She had been afraid, and it hadn't been a vague, directionless fear. It had been focused on Dr. Collins. Darius had spent enough time around sick and injured people to know the difference between disorientation and pure, unfiltered terror. And what he had seen in Layla's face was not normal. Collins had played it off well. Too well. He had answered every question with perfect ease, as if he had expected them, as if he had prepared for them. Darius had been tired, overwhelmed, desperate to believe that his daughter's fear was just some confused reaction to trauma. But now, standing alone in the hallway, his exhaustion wasn't clouding his mind anymore. His gut was screaming at him, and he had learned a long time ago never to ignore that feeling. Darius made his way to the nurse's station. A young woman with a name tag that read Amanda sat behind the desk, typing something on a screen. She looked up when he approached, offering a small, polite smile. "Mr. Thompson," she greeted, "is everything okay?" Darius forced a tight smile. Yeah, I had some questions about my daughter's case." Amanda's expression softened. "Of course. What do you need to know?" He hesitated. He wasn't sure how much he could ask without raising suspicion. How long was she supposed to be in a coma? Amanda blinked at the question as if she hadn't expected it. Well, comas are difficult to predict. Some patients wake up in days, others much longer. Darius nodded. I know, but based on her initial injuries, what was the expectation? Amanda frowned slightly, turning back to her computer. Let me check. She typed quickly, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency. The screen cast a soft glow on her face as she scanned the information. Then her brows knitted together. That's odd, she muttered. Darius felt his stomach tighten. What is? Amanda hesitated as if choosing her words carefully. When she was admitted, the original prognosis estimated a recovery period of a few weeks at most before regaining consciousness. But it looks like she was kept in a medically induced coma for much longer than expected. Darius's breath caught. Kept in a coma? Why? He asked, his voice sharper than intended. Amanda hesitated again. The notes say it was due to complications, but I don't see any major incidents that would have required such a prolonged state. And she trailed off, her frown deepening. Darius leaned forward. And what? She clicked a few more keys, her eyes darting across the screen. Most of the adjustments to her treatment plan were made by Dr. Collins himself. A chill crawled up Darius's spine. Dr. Collins. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. The doctor who had insisted she needed more time. The doctor who had been the only one allowed to oversee her case. The same man she had screamed about the moment she woke up. Darius swallowed against the bile rising in his throat. Amanda must have noticed the tension in his face because she hesitated. Is something wrong, sir? He forced himself to breathe, to think. He needed to be careful. If Collins had gone this far to control Layla's condition, then he was dangerous. And if he realized Darius was onto him, onto whatever the hell this was, he might try to cover his tracks. No, Darius said quickly, offering a tight, forced smile. I wasn't expecting that. Thank you, Amanda. She gave him a small nod. Of course. Let me know if you need anything else. Darius turned away, his heart pounding. His daughter had been kept in a coma on purpose, and the man responsible for it was still walking the halls of this hospital. Still watching. Still waiting. Darius clenched his jaw, shoving his hands into his pockets. Whatever Collins was hiding, he was going to find out. And he would not let him get near Layla again. Darius walked down the hospital corridor, his footsteps measured but purposeful. His mind was racing, each step heavy with the weight of what he had just learned. Layla had been kept in a coma deliberately. Dr. Collins had controlled every aspect of her care, ensuring that no one interfered with whatever he had been doing to her. But why? Darius clenched his jaw, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. There was something bigger at play here. His gut was screaming at him that this wasn't just about Layla. Something told him that she wasn't the first, and, terrifyingly, she might not be the last. He needed answers. He needed to know exactly what Collins had been doing. And he knew just where to start looking. The hospital's medical records department was located in a separate wing of the building, away from the patient rooms and high-traffic areas. It was quiet, almost eerily so, the kind of silence that felt unnatural in a place meant to be filled with life. Darius pushed open the door, stepping inside. Rows of filing cabinets lined the walls, alongside sleek computers displaying digital patient records. The glow of the screens flickered in the dim room, casting long shadows across the floor. A young receptionist sat at the front desk, her eyes flicking up when she noticed him. "Mr. Thompson?" she asked, clearly recognizing him. Darius forced a smile, though his stomach was twisting into knots. "Hey, yeah, I was hoping to take a look at some patient files," he said, keeping his voice casual. "Just trying to understand a bit more about my daughter's treatment." The receptionist hesitated. "Normally, those records are restricted to authorized medical personnel." Darius exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. "I understand. But I spoke to Nurse Amanda at the station earlier, and she mentioned some inconsistencies in my daughter's case. I just want to make sure everything adds up." A brief pause, then she nodded. "I can't give you full access, but I can pull up any files related to Dr. Collins' cases." Darius' heart thudded. That was exactly what he needed. She turned to her computer, fingers flying across the keyboard as she navigated through the system. The screen flickered as she typed, pulling up a list of names. Then she froze. Her brows furrowed and her lips parted slightly. "That's strange," she murmured. Darius leaned forward. "What?" The receptionist glanced at him, then back at the screen. "There's a pattern here," she said, scrolling through the list. "Dr. Collins has overseen a significant number of coma patients over the past few years, more than usual." Darius's stomach churned. "How many?" She hesitated. "At least a dozen in the last year alone." A dozen. Layla hadn't been his only victim. Darius's pulse pounded in his ears as he scanned the list of names flashing on the screen. Each one represented a patient, a person who had been under Collins' care, just like Layla. His gaze landed on the discharge column. His breath caught. None of them had been discharged. None of them had woken up. The receptionist's frown deepened. "Wait, that's not right." Darius's hands gripped the edge of the counter. "What is it?" She scrolled further. "Most of these patients, they're not here anymore, but there's no record of their transfer or release." Darius felt ice creep up his spine. "What do you mean they're not here?" She exhaled, clicking through more files. "Usually, if a patient passes away or is moved to another facility, there are records documenting what happened. But these files just stop." She pointed to the names. "There are no notes on what happened to them. No cause of death, no discharge paperwork, no official transfer, just silence." Darius's stomach twisted into a knot so tight he could barely breathe. 12 coma patients, all under Collins' care. And now they were gone. He swallowed hard, his fingers curling into his palms. Layla had woken up, but these other patients hadn't. What had Collins done to them? Where had they gone? Darius's pulse thundered in his ears. His entire body felt tense, every muscle on edge. Something was very, very wrong. Darius left the records office with his mind spinning. His feet carried him down the corridor, though he barely noticed where he was going. His thoughts were racing, pieces of a horrifying puzzle clicking into place. Layla had almost been one of them, one of the missing. Collins had kept her under his control for months, and if she hadn't woken up when she did, if she had stayed asleep for just a little longer, she might have vanished just like the others. Darius gritted his teeth. That wasn't going to happen. Not to Layla, not to anyone else. He needed to find out what Collins was really doing, and he needed to do it fast. Back at Layla's room, the atmosphere was still. The beeping of the machines was steady, her small form curled up under the thin hospital blanket. Her breathing was slow, measured, but Darius could tell she wasn't really asleep. She was listening, waiting, and afraid. Darius sat beside her, running a hand through his hair. His jaw was tight, his muscles tense. She stirred slightly at his presence but didn't open her eyes. "Dad?" she whispered. His chest ached at the sound of her voice, so small, so fragile. "I'm here, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice softer than he felt. "I'm not going anywhere." She shifted, the blanket rustling. For a moment, they sat in silence. Then her voice came again, barely a whisper. "He's not done." Darius's breath hitched, his entire body locked up at her words. She didn't need to say who. He already knew. Collins. Darius clenched his fists. He had to stop this. He had to stop him. Before it was too late. Layla lay motionless in the hospital bed, the blanket pulled up to her chest, her fingers curling into the fabric as if it could somehow shield her. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint blue glow of the machines monitoring her vitals. The rhythmic beeping filled the silence, a steady reminder that she was alive, that she was still here. But for how long? Her father sat beside her, his posture rigid, his hands clasped together as if he was trying to contain something. His mind was somewhere else, deep in thought, caught in the storm of unanswered questions. Layla didn't need to see his face to know that he was afraid. She could feel it in the way the air felt heavier around them. He knew something was wrong, and now so did she. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Layla kept her eyes on the ceiling, trying to focus on the patterns in the tiles, the small cracks in the paint, anything to keep her mind from spiraling. But the memories wouldn't stay buried. They clawed their way back, unrelenting, demanding to be seen. She took a shaky breath, willing herself to stay calm. "Dad," she whispered. Darius straightened immediately, his attention snapping back to her. His eyes were tired, but they were full of something fierce, something protective. "I remember," she said, her voice barely audible. Her father stiffened. He didn't say anything, but his expression darkened. Layla swallowed. Her throat was dry, but she forced herself to keep going. "The accident," she murmured. I remember the lights, the sound, the impact." She hesitated, her breath hitching. But that's not all. Her father didn't push her. He just sat there, waiting, letting her speak on her own terms. She closed her eyes for a moment, forcing herself to relive the pieces of her memory that had started to return. The headlights, the screech of metal, the brief moment of weightlessness before her world went black. And then, the voice. Low, measured, chilling in its calmness. "She cannot wake up." Her heart clenched. She could hear it so clearly now as if it had never left her. The way the words had slithered into her subconscious, curling around her mind like a noose. She opened her eyes again, staring at the ceiling. "I heard him," she whispered, "while I was asleep. I heard him talking to me." Her father's breath caught, but he didn't speak. Layla turned her head slowly, her eyes locking onto his. It was Dr. Collins. The words felt like lead in her mouth. Darius's jaw tightened, his expression unreadable, but his silence said everything. He had suspected. He just hadn't wanted to believe it. Layla forced herself to keep going, even as the fear coiled tighter around her. "He was in my room," she murmured, "when I was in the coma. He came in and he talked to me like I wasn't there, like I would never wake up." Darius's hands curled into fists. "What did he say?" he asked, his voice low. Layla swallowed hard. "He said he couldn't let me wake up." A shiver ran through her as she spoke the words out loud for the first time. Her father inhaled sharply, but still he didn't interrupt. Layla squeezed her eyes shut. I think he was the one who put me in the coma in the first place." The moment the words left her lips, the air in the room seemed to shift. It wasn't a possibility anymore. It was real. Her father exhaled slowly, as if trying to steady himself. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his fingers gripping his temples. Layla watched him carefully, her stomach twisting. She knew this was a lot. Too much. But she had kept it inside for too long. Finally, after what felt like forever, Darius looked at her again. His eyes weren't just tired anymore. They were full of rage. "He did this to you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Layla nodded slowly. He stood suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. His entire body was tense, as if he was barely keeping himself from exploding. "Dad," she said softly. He turned to her, his fists still clenched. She hesitated, then whispered, "He's not done." A long silence stretched between them. Darius swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. Then he nodded once. "I know." Darius left the room with a single thought running through his mind. He had to stop Collins. Not just for Layla. For all the others who hadn't been as lucky as her. He walked down the dimly lit hospital hallway, his mind working at 1,000,000 miles per hour. The missing patients, the unexplained coma cases, the complete lack of records on where they had gone. Collins had been doing something here, something far worse than just malpractice, and he was going to find out what. He reached the nurse's station and spotted Amanda, the same nurse who had helped him earlier. She looked up from her clipboard and frowned when she saw him. "Mr. Thompson?" she asked. "Is everything all right?" Darius hesitated. He knew he had to be careful. If Collins was as powerful as he seemed, then anyone in this hospital could be watching. "I need to know something," he said, keeping his voice low. Amanda's brows knitted together. "About what?" He glanced around, ensuring no one was listening. "The coma patients under Dr. Collins' care," he murmured. "The ones who never woke up." Amanda's eyes widened slightly. She looked around, suddenly cautious. "Mr. Thompson," she whispered, "I told you, those records—" "I'm not asking for files," he interrupted. "I just need to know if you remember any of them waking up. Even one." She hesitated. Then she slowly shook her head. Darius's stomach turned. None of them, not a single one. Amanda bit her lip, glancing around again before leaning in closer. "Something isn't right," she admitted quietly. "There were rumors among the staff about patients disappearing in the middle of the night. But every time someone asked questions, the records would just," she snapped her fingers, "vanish." Darius felt a chill run down his spine. "How long has this been going on?" he asked. Amanda exhaled. "Years. Years. Collins had been doing this for years." Darius clenched his jaw, the fury inside him growing. He had been so close to losing Layla forever. She'd only woken up by accident, and if she hadn't, she would have been just another missing file in the system, gone, without a trace. Darius straightened, his hands shaking slightly. He had seen enough. If Collins thought he could keep getting away with this, he was dead wrong. Because now, Darius was going to make sure that everyone knew the truth, no matter what it took. Darius's hands trembled with barely contained fury as he walked back toward Layla's room. His mind was a storm of thoughts, tangled and relentless, crashing into one another with the weight of realization. Collins had done this, not just to Layla, to all of them, the missing patients, the unexplained comas, the disappearances without records. This wasn't negligence. It wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. Collins had been choosing his victims, holding them under, keeping them asleep, just like he had done to Layla. And if she hadn't woken up when she did— Darius didn't let himself finish that thought. He couldn't. His breath was unsteady as he reached the hospital room door. He knew he had to act carefully. He wasn't dealing with a rogue doctor who had made one or two bad decisions. He was dealing with a predator. And Layla was still in danger. He pushed open the door, stepping inside. Layla was awake, sitting up slightly in the bed. The room was dim, illuminated only by the faint glow of the monitors beside her. The beeping of the heart monitor was steady, but there was an edge of tension in her posture and the way her fingers fidgeted with the blanket. She looked at him immediately, her eyes full of unspoken fear. She didn't ask where he had been. She already knew. Darius sat down beside her bed, his pulse still too fast, his body still wired with adrenaline. "We have to be careful," he murmured. Layla nodded. She didn't need him to explain. She already understood. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, but then, a sound, soft, faint, but there. Darius turned sharply toward the doorway. Footsteps. Layla stiffened. A shadow flickered just outside the room. Darius's breath caught. It was too late to hide. The door pushed open, and Collins stepped inside. The air in the room changed instantly. Collins' presence suffocated the space, turning the sterile air thick with an unspoken tension. His white coat was pristine, his expression calm, controlled, but his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, were unreadable. "I see you're still awake," he said smoothly, his voice a practiced lull of reassurance. Layla's fingers curled tighter into the blanket. Darius forced himself to stay still, to breathe, even as every instinct screamed at him to get his daughter away from this man. Collins turned to Darius, offering that same unreadable smile. "Mr. Thompson, I hope you've had a chance to rest. It's been a long day for all of us." Darius said nothing. His fists clenched at his sides. He knew what Collins was doing, testing him, seeing how much he knew. The doctor took a slow step forward. "Layla needs her rest. Her vitals are still stabilizing, and we wouldn't want any unnecessary stress delaying her recovery." His voice was too smooth, too composed, and then Darius saw it, the glint of something in Collins' hand, a syringe. His breath locked in his chest. The transparent liquid inside the needle glowed faintly in the dim hospital light. Layla saw it too. She went completely still, a prey that had just seen the hunter's teeth. Collins noticed the way they both reacted, how their bodies tensed, how their eyes flickered to the syringe in his grip, and he smiled, a small, knowing smile, a confirmation. He knew. And now he was going to finish what he started. Darius's body reacted before his mind could even process the decision. "Move. Now." He lunged. Collins barely had time to react. Darius grabbed his wrist, twisting violently. The syringe slipped from the doctor's grip, falling to the floor with a clatter. Collins grunted in surprise, but he recovered quickly. Too quickly. He shoved Darius back with more force than expected. Darius stumbled, but didn't fall. Collins' face twisted into something almost annoyed, as if this was nothing more than an inconvenience. "This isn't what you think," he said, voice still eerily calm. "I was simply administering." Darius swung. His fist connected with Collins' jaw, sending the doctor reeling back. Layla gasped. Collins staggered but caught himself, his head snapping up. And for the first time, Darius saw it. The mask cracked. The calm, collected expression fractured, and something dark and furious flickered behind his eyes. But it was only there for a second. Then, just as quickly, he smoothed it over. He exhaled, straightened his coat, and smiled again. "You shouldn't have done that," he murmured. Darius's skin crawled. The way he said it, Not angry, not even surprised. Just a simple statement. A warning. Collins dusted himself off as the sound of footsteps echoed in the hall. Nurses, security, people reacting to the commotion. He gave Darius one last lingering look. Then, in a voice only he could hear, he whispered, "She should have stayed asleep." Darius's blood turned to ice. The door burst open, and nurses rushed in. Collins immediately switched masks, his face morphing into one of concern, his voice smooth and professional. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said to the staff. Mr. Thompson was startled. He's understandably protective of his daughter, but I assure you, there's no need for alarm. Darius almost laughed. The audacity, the sheer audacity of this man to act innocent after everything. The nurses looked between them, confused. One of them bent down, picking up the syringe from the floor. She frowned. "Doctor, what is this?" Colin's expression didn't change. "A simple sedative. Layla's been experiencing extreme distress. I was merely ensuring she could rest." Darius shook his head. Layla's breath was uneven, her hands trembling under the blanket. He looked at her, really looked at her, and in her wide, terrified eyes he saw one clear truth. She remembered everything. Collins knew it, and now he wasn't just trying to keep her quiet, he was trying to erase her completely. Darius turned back to the nurses, his voice sharp. "Test that syringe." The nurse hesitated. Darius stepped forward. "Test it." A beat, then she nodded. Colin's expression didn't flicker. Darius could almost admire it. The sheer confidence, the boldness of a man who had gotten away with this for years. But not this time. This time, Collins had made a mistake. Because this time, Layla woke up. And he wasn't going to let this man touch his daughter again. Not now. Not ever. The tension in the hospital room was suffocating. The air felt thick, charged with something volatile, as if the entire room was teetering on the edge of an explosion. Darius stood firm, his fists still clenched, his entire body coiled and ready. His heart was hammering against his ribs, but his focus was razor-sharp. He wasn't backing down. Not now. Not when Collins had just tried to put his daughter back into a coma. The nurse who had picked up the syringe held it carefully, her fingers trembling slightly as she examined the liquid inside. The other medical staff in the room exchanged uncertain glances, their gazes flicking between Darius, Collins, and the fallen syringe on the floor. Darius knew what Collins was doing. He was banking on control, banking on the idea that no one would question him, that his reputation, his status as a doctor, his calm, steady demeanor, would shield him. And, for a moment, it almost worked. Collins smiled, a carefully curated, measured expression. His voice was smooth, unwavering. "I understand this looks bad." Darius nearly laughed at the audacity. Collins continued, his words measured. "But I assure you, the syringe contained nothing more than a mild sedative. Given Layla's distress, it was medically necessary to ensure she wouldn't experience further trauma." Layla's breath hitched. Darius saw the way she shrank back under the blankets, her small hands gripping the fabric so tightly her knuckles turned white. She knew what was happening. She knew Collins was lying. And so did Darius. He stepped forward. "I told you to test it." His voice was low, dangerous. The nurse hesitated. Collins turned his head to her, his smile warm. "That won't be necessary. I'll take responsibility for it." Darius's blood boiled. "No," he snapped. "It will be tested." The authority in his voice startled some of the staff. A ripple of uncertainty spread through the room. The nurse hesitated again, glancing toward Collins, then toward Darius. And then something shifted. A single thought flickered behind her eyes. doubt. Collins had controlled this hospital for a long time, but even he couldn't force her not to check, not in front of all these witnesses. She straightened slightly. "I'll take it to the lab." For the first time, Collins' jaw tightened. It was brief, so quick that most people wouldn't have noticed. But Darius did. A tiny crack in the facade. Collins' eyes flicked toward Darius, the faintest shift in expression. Not anger, not panic, calculation, adjusting, repositioning. And then, just as quickly, the smile returned. "Of course," Collins said smoothly. "I wouldn't want there to be any misunderstandings." Darius's teeth clenched. He knew Collins had just changed strategies. The nurse hurried out of the room, syringe in hand. Her movements rushed, as if she was suddenly afraid of what she had just touched. The remaining staff hesitated, unsure whether to stay or leave. Collins let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "This is unnecessary, you know." Darius glared at him. Collins sighed, as if he were disappointed. "I've been Layla's attending physician for months. Do you really believe I would harm her?" Layla flinched at the sound of his voice. Collins noticed. For the briefest moment, something dark flickered behind his expression, a hint of something wrong. Darius's fist tightened. "You don't get to talk to her," he growled. Collins turned back to him, tilting his head slightly. "I understand you're upset, Mr. Thompson, but I hope you'll come to realize that this is all a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. Darius's stomach churned. Collins was so sure of himself, so calm, because he believed nothing would happen to him, because he knew how to cover his tracks, because he had done this before. Time passed slowly. Darius didn't leave Layla's side. She barely spoke, barely moved, her body tense and small under the hospital blankets. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't empty. It was thick with fear. Then, footsteps. Darius looked up as a security guard stepped into the room. His stomach dropped. Collins was still standing near the door, his expression unreadable. But when the guard entered, Darius felt it, a shift in the air. Collins hadn't panicked. He had planned for this. The guard cleared his throat. "Mr. Thompson, I need to speak with you outside." Darius didn't move. His instinct screamed. He glanced at Layla, who was staring at the interaction with wide, frightened eyes. Collins watched. Not smug, not gloating, just waiting. Darius exhaled slowly and stood. He didn't want to leave Layla, but he knew if he refused, it would make things worse. As he stepped into the hallway, the guard shut the door behind them. Darius turned, his muscles still tense, his jaw clenched. The guard sighed. "Dr. Collins has expressed concerns about your behavior." Darius's stomach dropped further. "Excuse me?" The guard hesitated. "He claims you've been aggressive, that you've been interfering with hospital operations, that you physically attacked him." Darius's blood ran cold. Of course Collins had done this. He was flipping the narrative. He was making himself the victim. Because that's what predators did. Darius inhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay calm. "Listen to me. Collins is dangerous. He's been keeping patients in comas. Layla wasn't supposed to wake up. The others didn't." The guard gave him a long look. For a moment, Darius thought, hoped, that maybe, just maybe, the truth would be obvious. But then, "I have to ask you to leave the hospital." Darius's heart stopped. "What?" The guard exhaled. "Not permanently, but Dr. Collins has requested that you be removed for the time being, for your daughter's safety. For her safety." Darius nearly saw red. Collins was trying to get him away from Layla, to isolate her, to finish what he started. No, Darius said sharply. I'm not leaving her. The guard hesitated. Sir, if you refuse, we'll have to— I dare you, Darius growled. His pulse pounded in his ears. He wasn't leaving her, not while that man was still in this hospital. The air between them crackled with tension. Then a voice interrupted. Wait! Darius turned sharply. It was the nurse, the one who had taken the syringe. She was pale, her hand shaken, and in her fingers, a clipboard, a report. She swallowed, looking at the guard, then at Darius. Her voice was barely a whisper. You need to see this. Darius reached for the clipboard, and when he saw the results, his breath stopped. It wasn't a sedative in the syringe. It was something much worse, something designed to stop a heart. Darius looked up, and for the first time, Colin's mask cracked. The clipboard felt heavier in Darius's hands than it should have. The weight of it wasn't physical. It was the weight of truth, a truth that had been buried, hidden beneath layers of manipulation and lies. Now, finally, it was exposed. The nurse stood beside him, her face pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. She had seen it too. The lab report attached to the clipboard was undeniable proof. The syringe Collins had intended to inject into Layla wasn't a sedative at all. It was a paralytic agent, a drug that would have shut down her body, slowly suffocating her from the inside out, rendering her helpless as her organs failed one by one. It wouldn't have been an immediate death. It would have looked like a natural decline, a tragic case of a fragile young girl who simply didn't make it. No suspicion, no investigation, just another patient lost under Colin's care. Darius's grip tightened around the clipboard. His breathing was uneven, fury rolling through his chest like a thunderstorm. Collins had been seconds away from killing his daughter, and if Darius had hesitated for even a moment, if he had doubted himself, if he had let the doctor's smooth words convince him to step aside, Layla would be dead right now. The thought made his blood run cold. Collins was still in the room. Darius turned his gaze toward him, and for the first time since this all began, he saw something he hadn't seen before. Collins wasn't smiling. The carefully constructed mask he had worn for so long had finally cracked. It was subtle. Most people wouldn't have noticed it. The way his jaw tensed just slightly, the way his fingers twitched at his sides, the way his eyes flickered toward the exit, calculating his next move. For the first time, Collins was afraid. He was losing control, and he knew it. Darius felt a dark, satisfying fury coil in his gut. You were going to kill her, he said, his voice low and steady. Collins exhaled, slow and measured, but his gaze was still calculating, still searching for a way out. That's a serious accusation, he said smoothly. I understand your emotions are running high, but you need to be rational about this. I'm a doctor, Mr. Thompson. My job is to protect my patients. Darius took a step forward, forcing Collins to take a half step back. Protect them? His voice was ice. Like you protected the others? Collins' expression didn't change, but his eyes did, a flicker, a confirmation. He knew exactly what Darius was talking about. The missing patients. The ones who had never woken up. This wasn't about medicine. It had never been about medicine. It was about control. Collins had spent years choosing his victims, keeping them under, silencing them before they could wake up, before they could talk. Layla had been his mistake. She had woken up too soon. She had remembered. And now it was over. The security guard still stood between them, shifting uncertainly as he tried to process what was happening. The nurses in the room were watching now. Not just Darius, but Collins. Watching the way the doctor's usual calm, professional demeanor was starting to crack. The weight of doubt was settling over them. Doubt in the doctor they had trusted for so long. Doubt in the stories he had told. Doubt in the system that had protected him. One of the nurses, a woman who had been silent until now, stepped forward, her voice hesitant. "Doctor, what is this?" Collins turned to her, quick as a whip, his expression smoothing out instantly. "It's nothing," he said, voice calm. "A misinterpretation. The lab report must have been mixed up. I would never—" "Enough," Darius growled. The room fell silent. Collins looked at him, and this time, Darius saw something real in his face. Resignation. He knew there was no talking his way out of this, not this time. Collins exhaled through his nose. "Fine," he muttered. His voice had changed, lower, rougher, stripped of its usual politeness. "You think you've won?" Darius didn't blink. "I know I have." The next hour passed in a blur. Hospital administration was alerted. Security escorted Collins away. He didn't resist, didn't argue. It was almost too easy, the way he let himself be led out, like he had already accepted the inevitable, like he had planned for this possibility. Darius didn't care. Let him scheme. Let him try to find a way to slither out of this, because this time there was evidence. And this time Layla was awake. She had survived him. That alone was Collins' greatest failure. Darius stayed by her side the entire time. Layla didn't speak much, but she didn't need to. She was safe now. That was all that mattered, or at least that's what Darius wanted to believe. It was midnight by the time the hospital settled. Collins was gone. His office was being searched. Police would be involved soon. It should have felt like a victory, so why didn't it? Darius sat by Layla's bed, watching the slow rise and fall of her breathing. She was asleep now, really asleep. No more drugs in her system, no more voices whispering in the dark. But even in sleep, she looked tense. And when she shifted, when her face scrunched slightly, as if she was caught in a dream, Darius felt his chest tighten. He didn't realize he was gripping the armrest of the chair until his knuckles ached. Something was still wrong. Layla had said something earlier, something he had pushed aside in the chaos, but now, sitting here in the quiet, he heard her words again. "He's not done." A chill crawled up Darius's spine. She hadn't just meant Collins, had she? Darius swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe evenly. Maybe it was just fear. Maybe it was just the paranoia settling after the worst night of his life. Maybe Layla was just scared. Maybe that was all it was. Maybe. But then, a noise. A soft hum. Darius turned his head sharply, looking toward the corner of the room. There, tucked near the wall, was one of the hospital monitors still connected to Layla's vitals. The screen flickered slightly. Just a glitch, just static. And then, the screen flashed once. A message blinked across it. One single word. A name. Collins. Darius's breath caught. The screen flickered again, then the name was gone, as if it had never been there. A glitch. Just a glitch. Except Darius knew better. His pulse thundered. Collins was gone, but the fight wasn't over, because someone else was still watching. And this time, they knew he was watching back. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. Check out more videos. You won't want to miss them. And if you enjoyed this one, share it with others.